Aloha kako. My name is Zoe Hastings, and today I'd like to share with you the results of some research that I did in partnership with Maile Wong and Tamara Tigton and agroforestry practitioners across Hawaii. This research is really looking at the spread of agroforestry that's occurring today in Hawaii and understanding what people's barriers and the opportunities of this work are. So farming in forest systems that integrate trees or crops or other harvested plants or animals is sometimes called agroforestry, but many times these practices are traditional and customary practices of Native Hawaiians or other indigenous and local communities. So from this map, you can see agroforestry was an important land use practice in areas relatively close to where people live. From this study by Natalie Kurashima and her co-authors, we also know that agroforestry systems were a significant source of food production pre-European contact. But colonization, dispossession of Native Hawaiian lands, plantation era agricultural management practices, and other factors have resulted in large decline in agroforestry practices throughout the islands. Today, there's growing interest in agroforestry as a solution for simultaneously achieving food security, climate change mitigation, and adaptation, and biocultural restoration. Yet ensuring that these efforts to promote these systems translate to socially just landscape change requires a critical understanding of how agroforestry is already occurring in Hawaii. So we designed a study to better understand how agroforestry is occurring today and what are people's obstacles and what are constraints and what are opportunities. So specifically, we asked what factors drive and or restrain transitions to agroforestry and who is able to participate. To explore this question, we wanted to pay attention to the ecological factors, since we know that transitions to agroforestry fundamentally involve people changing the structure and levels of biodiversity and landscapes. But also social factors, because these stewardship decisions are made in complex political, economic contexts that are mediated by power relations. For example, a person's decision to practice agroforestry can be affected by their access to capital, land, and labor, and what regulations are present. Additionally, someone's social and economic power can affect their ability to access these resources. We therefore designed a qualitative study to understand drivers and constraints to agroforestry and who gets to practice, paying attention to power dynamics and the political economic context. We wanted to talk with people already practicing agroforestry, including people harvesting for subsistence, sharing, or sale, to better understand this context. We defined agroforestry as a continuum of systems that integrate woody plants and crops or livestock or other tended and harvested plants or animal species. So this continuum or spectrum includes the areas in green in this figure, as well as systems that integrate animals, which are not shown here. Importantly, we wanted to include people who identify with agriculture, forest restoration, or conservation that fit in this spectrum, or anything in between this forest restoration and conservation and agriculture. We conducted semi-structured interviews following a guide via Zoom between August of 2020 and March 2021. We developed an initial list of 15 businesses, nonprofit organizations, and subsistence farmers practicing some form of agroforestry, from informal interviews with farmers, farmer support personnel, and land managers. And then we asked we interviewed for suggestions of other folks to talk with. We transcribed the interviews and then coded them for themes using an inductive approach to let the themes emerge from the transcripts. We continued interviewing participants until we reached the point where no new themes arose from additional interviews. In this case, it was 31 interviews. Once we had preliminary results, we held a focus group meeting via Zoom. The goal of this meeting was to share preliminary findings with interview participants, facilitate reflection, and get feedback on the results. So next, I want to describe some of the characteristics of the group of folks we were able to interview. We interviewed 38 practitioners, so some of the interviews included multiple stewards of one site. And here's how they self-identified. 68% were male, half were Native Hawaiian, and the median age was 46 years. These practitioners represent 31 sites, which we defined as land parcels stewarded by families, businesses, or nonprofit organizations. And 67% of the sites co-own or own at least a part of the land that they steward. Of the 33% of sites who rent land, most of them lease from Kamehameha Schools, the state's largest private landowner, and most sites are less than 20 acres. All sites are growing or raising at least 10 species each, and this is a list of some of the primary species that people grow for harvest. Most sites are integrating plants at the plot level in multi-story systems as opposed to the field or margin levels. The majority of practitioners gained access to former plantation agriculture or ranching lands that were fallow and transitioned from non-native grasses, shrubs, and or trees to agroforestry. Only 4 practitioners had been practicing a less diverse type of agriculture. So for example, one type of vegetable or tree crop on the same parcel before transitioning to agroforestry. 2 sites transitioned actively managed pasture land to agroforestry by planting trees, which is sometimes called silvopasture. 3 practitioners inherited family legacy lands that already had an agroforest on it. Next, I want to share our results, which are broken into 3 parts. So first, of the group of people that we interviewed, we found that practitioners' motivations for practicing agroforestry relate to these 2 big areas. One being their values, practitioners' values, and 2, the direct benefits of agroforestry. So here are the main dimensions of themes related to people's motivations for practicing. I don't have time to go through each of the individual themes today, but I will explain each of the dimensions that are listed here. It's also important to note that although not all of the values-based themes are linked exclusively to agroforestry, each practitioner expressed a suite of themes, including agroforestry-specific reasons. So the first dimension of values-based themes was to restore relationship to Aina, ancestors, and culture. The most referenced theme in this dimension was, quote, to reverse the damage of plantation agriculture and ranching. For example, practitioners lamented how, quote, this cattle system has decimated this valley, and, quote, how abused the soils were. But the damage they saw was not just environmental. Practitioners also spoke of the social problems in their communities as motivation for their practices. Several themes in this dimension were related to agroforestry specifically, such as the template was created by our ancestors to bring the forest back and to have materials for cultural practices. For example, one practitioner expressed, so what motivated us to take on a farming practice like this? Part of that for me always goes back to the Olelo no Eao, Ikava ma mua, Ikava ma hope. The answers to the future lie in the past. And so I believe in order for us to look at planning for our future, we need to, at the very least, understand our history and learn from it. Or in what I believe now is more to go back to most of it. The second dimension of motivators was to strengthen and elevate local communities. Over half of the practitioners we spoke with referenced that they were motivated to feed our community. For example, one practitioner expressed, we're trying to elevate our community to the status of being able to be autonomous, to be able to be sovereign, and so we have to start with growing food. It was common for practitioners to open with how their values motivated them, but many also went on to share motivations related to the direct benefits of agroforestry. So almost half of practitioners discussed how they practice agroforestry for their own health and wellness. As one practitioner said, quote, I have not had to go to a therapist or a psychologist since I started agroforestry. The other themes listed in order of the most referenced here were varied. Many have to do with the practicalities of reduced maintenance. Importantly, there are only a few references to direct economic benefits, for example, through diversifying income at the bottom of this list as a motivation for agroforestry. The second part of the results are the challenges. We found that agroforestry practitioners have similar challenges as other small, diversified agricultural practitioners, and also unique constraints. Challenges common to other forms of agriculture included structural ones, like access to capital, land, labor, and infrastructure, and also ecological challenges, like non-native plants, pests and diseases, pig and deer disturbance, water access, poor soil quality, and fire. Importantly, though, practitioners also describe many obstacles in the unique context of agroforestry, which is what we're going to focus on today. So the 4 key domains of the themes in these agroforestry specific obstacles are shown here, and we'll go through each of these. So first, many practitioners express how they fall through the cracks because systems for accessing land, capital, and markets favor short-term production and economic value, which doesn't align with their practices and values. For example, one practitioner explained, "There's not many people that want to take up projects like this because it doesn't make the economics." So it's almost like you got to work with whoever can provide you with a capital structure to really even get going. If I could do this in my own backyard, that would be ideal. Agroforestry, quote, "not making the economics," incorporates the tension agroforestry practitioners face between finding secure long-term land access, having the startup capital, and being able to keep up with maintenance and expenses while waiting for the long-term benefits of trees. The second dimension of themes was that Indigenous and local knowledge is not adequately valued. For example, one practitioner said, "They basically have these cookbook recipes on how to responsibly manage land and deal with erosion and all of that. And some of it's good, but I think it just takes the creativity and some of the experience and maybe some of the wisdom out of managing something, some of the relationship, all of that stuff that's hard to touch and put your finger on. But those are maybe more important than just like everything must be 14 feet apart and here's your list of appropriate species." Many of the practitioners, or the tension between locally specific practices and the need to generalize across sites to provide support is a challenge, which is given in this example quote of the practitioner talking about a support organization. Many of the practitioners we spoke with see agroforestry as more than a technical practice. It was about their non-economic values, so struggled in this current context. The third dimension of challenges is that institutions, including organizations, agencies, and also social norms and worldviews, are siloed or separated between forestry and conservation and agriculture. One practitioner explained how agroforestry practitioners, whose practices often sit between the silos, fall through the cracks. They said, "When you're talking to policymakers and they have no idea what you're talking about as far as agroforestry, it's very difficult to try and get them to attach to the idea that we need leases extended." For them, it's like, well, why don't you go do farming the way everybody else does farming? Finally, even when people can get past the other structural barriers of the previous dimensions, they still face the issue that not enough appropriate information is accessible. The most referenced themes in this dimension were that so much knowledge is lost and not many people are doing this work to learn from. As one Native Hawaiian practitioner expressed, when they planted the coffee, they got rid of a lot of the indigenous plants they were growing, and they forgot about them. During my father-in-law's generation, he grew some of the biggest taro I've ever seen, and it's dry land, so they knew where to plant. And because you don't have water, you have to plant at a certain time. They had the knowledge. Right now, we're just kind of experimenting. Finally, we coded the interview responses for the factors affecting practitioners' ability to start and maintain their agroforestry practices, including what has allowed them to overcome or persist despite the obstacles. We found that access to offsite resources that are inequitably distributed shapes who gets to practice agroforestry. So in this table, on the left side, we have the obstacles, and then on the right side is the actual list of themes that were coded of how that came from the interviews of how people circumvent or persist despite the obstacles. So there are many ways we can see from this table that practitioners are circumventing or persisting despite obstacles. However, the most referenced and repeated themes were the ability to self-fund and having the skills to acquire grant funding. Other themes related to being able to put in extra time. Many practitioners, especially Native Hawaiian practitioners, spoke about how they wear extra hats to self-advocate, find partners, act as a translator, etc. This additional unpaid labor required to persist is a major challenge and disproportionately affects those practitioners who don't have the financial resources to self-fund. For example, one practitioner explained, "We were lucky because of our professional background that we can write grants. I mean, we never thought grant writing is a thing, a skill to have, but I guess we're used to being grant writers and whatnot. So we could write for grants, and that's a disadvantage that other farmers have." Finally, practitioners overcame the lack of appropriate information in different ways. Many of the practitioners we spoke with had experienced traditional agroforestry firsthand in other parts of the Pacific and Latin America, either through employer-funded or self-funded trips. Additionally, having a mentor or access to ike kupuna, for example, through a relative or archival research, were important in their ability to put together the knowledge to be able to do their work. And as one practitioner called this, triangulating knowledge. So this artwork by Tehina Kahikina illustrates the results of the study, from which a few key points emerge. First, we find that agroforestry is intentionally chosen as a form of restoration and reclamation of sovereignty, not only as a means to production and economic benefits. In this way, for many of the practitioners we spoke with, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, transitioning to agroforestry was a political act through which practitioners sought to reverse social and ecological damage. Practitioners chose agroforestry purposely as a form of ecological or biocultural restoration. Second, agroforestry faces an important contradiction. The same institutions that promote agroforestry also perpetuate the dominant systems of resource access, values, and silos that constrain agroforestry practitioners. Our findings highlight the need to revise how agroforestry is framed in outreach policy and programs to be more inclusive of people trying to restore and adapt historical Indigenous agroforestry systems, rather than simply transition to agroforestry as a means to achieve simultaneous production, economic, and environmental benefits. And then third, despite the challenges, many practitioners are making it work, but more support is really needed to improve access to agroforestry transitions. For example, restoring long-term land access that empowers Indigenous practitioners, revaluing Indigenous and local knowledge, and rebuilding resilient support infrastructure for agroforestry practitioners. So we'd like to say a big mahalo to all the practitioners who contributed to this research, to my co-authors, Maile and Tamara, to Tehina for making the beautiful illustration, and Krishna Suryanata for comments on the draft, and as well as Leah Bremer, and then the funders on the right here. If you have any questions or would like to learn more about this work, please email me at this address. Thanks.